Hi everybody, Steve Griffiths here, developer of the MTPredictor software program. Today I'd like to have a look at a quick review of a market we were looking at in yesterday's customer training webinar, and that was the 3-minute Russell Index, particularly in and around this TS1 sell setup here that actually turned out to be a nice Holy Grail trade, if I put the analysis on, where the market went through the first target and actually went on to the typical wave 3 WPT. This is what I outlined in yesterday's webinar, actually live as this was unfolding. So it's good to actually review this and see how the market did indeed unfold exactly as I was anticipating in the webinar. But just for everybody else, I'd like to review how this market set up and how we knew that this was a potential Holy Grail trade and therefore to use the typical wave 3 WPT. The Holy Grail trade is a trade that I talk about a lot, and the first part of it is the larger degree trend. So for this I'll just clear the chart off, and what I want to show is the thinking I had behind this at the time in the webinar. This is a 15-minute chart of the Russell Index. As always, we put our DPs on in advance. Now that's the trick to trading, is to be able to have levels of support and resistance on the chart in advance. As you can see, I clicked on DP, then chose the prior high here. We had this level up here that, as you can see, the market gapped into and made a nice high. So that's the first part of our Holy Grail trade, is that we're at an important high. We then look for the initial decline off that high, then the initial correction off that high. So that sets us up for the initial part, which is the larger degree high coming in. If I go back to the 3-minute chart and I scroll back a bit, I'll clear the chart off. If I go back before the TS1 even unfolded, and I'll put the DP support on back from the same pivot which was here, and as you can see, this is exactly what the Russell Index did. Went up to tag this DP support, and in fact this turned out to be the high of the day. So that's the first thing, is that MTPredictor had predicted the high of the day for you in advance. Even before the market got there, i.e. before the market even opened, you had that level on your chart. But we were looking for the initial decline, which unfolded into here. We were then looking for the initial rally, which, if I went a little bit too far, which actually unfolded as a TS1 setup. I'll just take that off the chart to clear it up a bit. So what we do with the Holy Grail setup is we put our analysis on. First of all, we ignore the STF color because we assume that this is going to be an Elliott wave 2, because this is our first major high. Therefore, we're always going to be against the STF because it's early in the trend. But the difference in a Holy Grail trade is we don't look to take profit our first target. We're actually aiming for our typical wave 3 WPT down here. So if I put the risk reward on down at this level, you can see we're about 5.9 or almost 6 to 1. The reason for this is because this is a major high, we're assuming this is a wave 1, therefore we're assuming this is a wave 2, therefore we're anticipating a wave 3, i.e. into the typical wave 3 WPT. So let's see what unfolded. And again, this was actually live. We were actually talking about this live in the webinar yesterday as it was unfolding. So there's no hindsight here. This was actually unfolding as we were talking about it. And as you can see, the market did indeed go down and reach the typical wave 3 WPT. So at the very first level we were anticipating, there was a potential 5.9R profit. Now that means a dollar profit of about $2,100, or for an initial risk of $360. In other words, 5.9 times the initial risk. That's why these trades are so good, because they have profits that are much larger than the initial risks. And this is why I like this trade, particularly because it's the best trade in that you get in right at the end of the wave 2 to then come into a strong wave 3 type swing. In fact, it's the best Elliott wave trade setup there is. So that's where I was suggesting the first target, so plus 5.9R profit at that level. However, some traders were also using, in the webinar, they were suggesting they wanted to use the ATR stop because the STF was strong at this level, and if I use the ATR stop, it actually, these red dots, it actually held you all the way down into just about here is where it took you out. So for those MTPredictor traders in the webinar who used the ATR stop, would have actually increased their profit a little bit more to plus 7.3R. So yeah, an even better trade. I also did suggest in the webinar that the opposing target on the 15-minute chart was the DP of the prior low, again on the chart in advance. So remember, we were looking to be short from the 3-minute TS1 about here, and I was suggesting that this was the next major support for the Russell Index if it got there. If I go forward, lo and behold, the market did indeed reach that level, and in fact that actually managed to be the low of the day. So here we were yesterday with MTPredictor nailing the very high of the day on the Russell Index and nailing the very low of the day on the Russell Index. Now both of those were in advance. Now that's pretty good trading. So if I go back to the 3-minute chart and I put that 15-minute DP on, which would have actually been from this low here, so I'll put that on the chart there. And as you can see, that did actually indeed tag that low down there very nicely indeed. So if you had come out right at that level, MIT at that level there, whoops, that was a little bit, missed the initial stop. So I'll put that on there. It was a potential 8.9R. And if I zoom out and go to the end of the day, you can see that, yes indeed, that was the absolute low of the day. So there we go, a brilliant example of a MTPredictor trade where we in advance project the level where the high of the day on the Russell Index was going to unfold. We then also projected again in advance on the 15-minute chart where the low of the day was going to unfold, and as you can see it did indeed hit that. And in the webinar we looked at this TS1 setup, and I said at the very least we should come down to the typical wave 3 WPT, which you can see did indeed unfold for a plus 5.9R. But for those traders who are a little bit more aggressive and wanted to run it a little bit further into the lower support zone, there was a slightly higher profit available. But at the very least, this was a perfect example of the Holy Grail trade where we had a TS1 sell down into the typical wave 3 WPT for at least plus 5.9R. So a brilliant trading day yesterday, and a brilliant example of MTPredictor in action, and particularly of how these levels were placed on the chart in advance and how this trade was unfolding in real time in the webinar when I was talking about these levels that the trade was going to. So great example of MTPredictor, and a great day yesterday on the USE minis, particularly on the 3-minute Russell Index.